This is a Trident Disabilities audio archive recording read by a Trident volunteer of I Ask Why by Bruno M. Arnold. January in upstate New York never failed to perfectly personify the brisk chill that was capable of waking up even the state's most nocturnal cave-dwelling residents. Despite an assumption that the Binghamton General Hospital would be even more frigid, Janet had no worries besides the flood of warmth exuding from her heart and a little ball resting in her arms. "Have you decided on a name?" the nurse asks. Janet looked up at Mark, but he hasn't peeled his eyes off their baby girl for the past hour. She couldn't believe her luck. Here was this amazing man always there to support her, and who now she was starting a family with. She remembered that verdant green Ford Mustang he always thought he looked so cool driving, when he took her to Whitney Bridge on their third date, and 3 years later when he asked her to marry him there. "What about Allison?" Mark said. She thought for a moment, then said, "Yeah, Allison's perfect." On the drive home, Mark heard Janet snoring in the seat next to him. Something that used to bother him now made him smile. Pulling into the driveway, he was prepared to wake Janet before he realized how peaceful they looked. He rolled down the windows, removed his tattered blue jacket, and laid it over the two of them, waiting for the sun to drop behind the trees. July dawned rays of crisp orange hues which penetrated the remnant armies of winter past. Janet slipped on a pair of sunglasses to block the intruding summer soldiers from also invading her vehicle. Mark was occupied with a battle of his own, trying to buckle Allison's complex car seat while simultaneously trying to hold back his language, which should only be reserved for the sea shanties of old. Janet couldn't hold back from teasing him in this moment as Allison giggled and wriggled around his hands, thinking her daddy was trying to tickle her. "You know those metal things are supposed to connect to the red buttons in the middle, right?" Janet said. "Oh, so you aren't supposed to just tie it under the seat these days?" Mark replied. "Hey, you better change that attitude, mister, or I'm going to tell the doctor you still can't figure out the car seat," Janet replied. "Oh yeah, that's going to be interesting testimony from the girl who has a red spot on her arm because she hasn't figured out the microwave timer yet," said Mark. Janet slumped back against her seat and gave Mark a pouty look until he recognized her silence. Mark gave her a kiss on the cheek and she began to laugh. Janet knew he could never resist that look, and so she wielded that power, in her opinion, quite fairly. Janet watched as Mark scribbled their names into the intake forms at Dr. Barber's pediatrician office, while Allison was attempting to grab her feet in the carrier next to her. "Mr. and Miss Cooper," the receptionist said. "Dr. Barber will see you now, second door on the right." Mike and Janet only had to wait briefly before Dr. Lauren Barber entered the room. She had seen Allison before for checkups, but she still used the many tools of her trade to ensure Allison's development was still on track. A nurse walks in and hands Dr. Barber a chart. The doctor thanks her and she begins to look over the chart. "Mr. and Miss Cooper, this is Allison's blood tests we took last time you were here," Dr. Barber said. "There are changes in Allison's MEPC2 gene," she continued. "What does that mean? Is she sick?" Janet responded. "Your daughter has Rett syndrome. It's a rare gene mutation, and she's not necessarily sick, but this will have an effect on her cognitive development," Dr. Barber said. "Is there a way to fix it?" Mark said. "Mr. Cooper, there's no known cure yet for Rett syndrome," Dr. Barber replied. Dr. Barber left the room and went to grab some information for the young couple. Janet looked up from her lap, curious if the sun had tucked behind the clouds or if Dr. Barber turned off a light when she left the room. The doctor returned with a single pamphlet that read, "How to Parent a Child with a Disability." September's gravity plucked the trees of their lush green summer wares, transferring the apparel to the naked asphalt of the streets below. Janet leaned against the doorframe, waiting for Mark's headlights to crawl up their driveway. Janet knows that Mark has to work late sometimes, but she wished he would call, or maybe she just wished it wasn't so many nights. Janet moved to the dining room where her heavy heart did most of the work in pulling her down to her chair. She stared at the fly, who, like an impatient waiter, seemed to understand it was time to clear the wine glasses because her date was never going to show. Janet unlocked her phone and scrolled down her various feeds before moving to her daily ritual of agony, trying to find information about Allison's condition. Life expectancy of children with Rett syndrome, until she realized either none of the information changed or she was too fatigued by Google's constant insinuations of what she meant. The door opened slowly as Mark tried to evade the many leaves attempting to hitchhike their way into the house on the bottom of his boots. Janet walked into their main foyer where she confronted her belated husband's arrival. "You know, dinner tastes better when it's warm," Janet remarked. "You know I have to work late, Janet," Mark replied. "Working late? Mark, you are late every day. At this point, it's just working, and I miss you being at home with us," she said. "Someone has to work to pay for Allison's medical expenses," Mark said. "Listen, I looked it up, and there's a grant out of California we can apply for," Janet said. "We never qualify for those, Janet. You know this, so why do you keep looking up?" Mark said. "I'm just trying to help, Mark," Janet replied. "Why don't you take that job offer your mom told you about in Johnson City?" Mark asked. "So that's what this is about, Mark, the money. We talked about this. I need to be home for our daughter. Why are you being like this?" Janet replied. "It's not just about the money, Janet. I just think it would be better for you to be working than just sitting here all day looking at things that only make you worried," Mark said. Janet sat down on the couch and began to sob. "I can't do this right now," Mark said. Mark threw the plate of food in the trash, grabbed his car keys, and left for a while. As he drove, Mark thought about how quickly his life had changed. Allison was this healthy little girl, and here she was sick, and there was nothing he could do about it. He worked extra hours so they could afford all of her appointments, and Janet didn't seem to realize that. Turning back onto their road, Mark started backing into the driveway. As he checked his rearview mirror, he glanced for a moment at the empty red car seat staring back at him. December drew a winter colder than ever. That didn't stop at the Coopers' front door. Mark helped Allison unwrap a stuffed bunny, blue in color, and despite being brand new, already had tattered tufts of hair that dotted the whole exterior of the gift. Janet and Mark both smiled when Allison shouted, "Ta-da!" after seeing the familiar gift. Decembers came and went. With each passing year, the trees, like Mark and Janet's relationship, shed their marvelous layers. Decembers for Allison were more fractured into two, and although she could feel the cold winter winds between her parents, she never felt anything but warmth directed at her. Despite graduating a year later than she expected, she earned salutatorian. After her speech, her dad came up and hugged her shortly, followed by her mother, and they agreed that Mom would take her to dinner tomorrow, and Dad would take her tonight before she left for college next week. Whitney Bridge in Upton, New York, felt like nothing to anyone who didn't know about it. It was old, tattered, and barely hanging on to the coastline, which it desperately wanted to keep. Years of stress left marks and bruises visible all over its face. The bridge had split straight down the middle as tides ejected from the coastline in different directions. It was the kind of curiosity that life was notorious for inventing. The tides moved outward and met together again in the larger ocean, and yet we wonder why the bridge had to be splintered at all. These were exactly Janet's thoughts that evening as she drove past Whitney Bridge with familiarity in her eye. A verdant green Ford Mustang acted as a backdrop for the tattered blue jacket of the vehicle's owner below. She turned down that old road and pulled in behind his car. Mark stood at the edge of the bridge, casting his line into the calm waters below. Janet approached and asked Mark if she could give it a try. Janet had never been much of an outdoorsy girl, but with each inch she pulled back, she became more confident in her cast. The bobber flew into the air before hitting the inlet sand with a thud, sprinkling sand across the air. "You know that metal thing is supposed to go into the middle of the water, right?" said Mark. "Oh, man, I thought we were trying to catch a sandfish tonight," Janet replied. Mark gave her a grin and asked if she had spoken to Allison recently. Janet said that she had called the other day asking for money to go out with her friends, but that it seemed she was settling in well. Mark laughed and told Janet that she asked him for money too. "We're going to have to coordinate better on that, said Janet. Then they both went silent, peering into the endless black pools below. Why were we so worried? Why did we work so hard? Why did we stress so much? Why were we afraid for her? Why did we think she wouldn't make it? Why did we let her go when she did? Why did we change, Mark? I ask why, too.